Retreat to the Seine, August 23rd to September 1st. The battlefront was getting further and further away. The enemy was still retreating. Our armoured columns were surging forward at such speed that the Germans were learning the hard way the meaning of their word, blitzkrieg. Doug Proctor, 4th Battalion, the Somerset Light Infantry, Section Commander. The crushing of the German forces in the Falaise Pocket and beyond by August 20th brought an effective end to German resistance in Normandy, but it did not end the Normandy campaign. The province of Normandy extends to the Seine and beyond, and it is easier to determine the start of the battle June 7th than decide on the precise date it ended. After Falaise, the outcome was not in doubt, but the retreating Germans had now to be pursued, and the pressure kept up until the enemy was finally defeated and their armies ground to dust. This desirable process was brought to a halt by the old problem supply. The problem was not simply the difficulty of supplying the frontline units with fuel and artillery ammunition. Some of the Allied armies in Normandy were running out of men. There were now 4 Allied armies in the field, but the British army could only get smaller as Britain ran out of troops. The breaking up of the British 59th Division, which was already in Normandy, and some of the tank brigades, in order to supply troops to the other British divisions or brigades, was only one indication that British manpower reserves were exhausted. This was not least because the wastage rate, the number of men killed and wounded in Normandy, had been far higher than anticipated. As with the US forces, the anticipated British losses had been based on casualty figures from the campaign in North Africa. The War Office had calculated that in periods of intense activity, i.e. battle, 48% of the casualties would be suffered by the infantry, 15% by the armoured corps, and 14% by the artillery. This forecast proved wildly out and extremely optimistic. Taking the Canadian units as an example of the Second Army totals, 76% of the casualties were in the infantry, 7% were in the tanks units and 8% in the artillery. Similar figures applied to the British units. To give some more examples, on August 7th, General Guy Simonds reported to Canadian Army HQ that his 2nd Infantry Division was 1,900 men short of establishment around 18%. By the end of the month, in spite of reinforcements, the situation was much the same. The 9 battalions of the 2nd Infantry Division were now 1,910 men short, all of them other ranks, sergeants, corporals and private soldiers. The percentage losses among the company officers was even higher, ranging up to 80%. In 1944, a British or Canadian infantry battalion contained 35 officers and 786 men, so the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's 9 battalions should have had a total of 7,389 men. The current and chronic shortage of 1,900 men represented a shortfall of 26%, and since almost all of this shortfall was in the rifle companies, the effect on the battalion's ability to fight was grievous. Richard Harris, a private in the 1st Battalion Suffolk Regiment, gives a bleak picture of his 30-man platoon. I can only tell you what happened from when we landed on D-Day until August 18th, nearly the end of the Battle of Normandy. On that day I was clobbered by a mortar round and wounded in both legs and my right hand, part of which had to be amputated. A corporal and myself were evacuated that day, the last of the platoon which had landed on D-Day, so our casualty rate in the Normandy battle was 100%. Losses on this scale soon took effect. An account from the 2nd Battalion, the Hertfordshire Regiment, which had gone to France on D-Day as a beach group battalion, engaged in beach protection and supply, records. The whole area of King Beach was extensively mined. In the King sector, we lifted and cleared over 120,000 mines. The battalion then settled down to its role of working the beach and moved an average of 1,500 tons per day, with 2,000 tons on our best day. On July 15th, a letter was received from General Montgomery, informing the commanding officer that he would have to use the battalion as infantry reinforcements. We came off the beach and carried out intensive training, hoping that we would be used as a complete battalion, but on August 17th the battalion was placed in suspended animation and drafts were duly sent to other units until by August 31st, only the commanding officer and the adjutant were left. Similar stories were recorded in the US infantry battalions which had suffered heavily in the fighting. To give one example from the phases of the campaign, in the advance to St. Lo, the US infantry divisions had lost some 40,000 men, of which 90%, 36,000, were riflemen. Officer casualties in many US regiments exceeded 100%. The Americans had almost unlimited manpower at this time, but these terrible infantry losses could not be sustained. The United States' abundance of men finally ran out towards the end of the European War in 1945, when a lack of white troops forced the US military to allow black soldiers to serve in combat units. By the end of the Normandy campaign, General Eisenhower was ordering a comb-out of rear echelon and administrative units in Britain and transferring fit men from base organizations to infantry units in France. For the moment, though, plenty of American reinforcements were being shipped in from the USA, but the growing number of American units only added further strains to the supply chain. Nor did this strain only affect Army units. The air forces were also under pressure. Most of the frontline squadrons and fighter groups of the two tactical air forces were now based in Normandy, and these forces, air and ground, needed a vast quantity of stores, all of which still had to be landed either through totally inadequate port facilities or over open beaches, and autumn was coming on, with the prospect of regular gales. Added to this was the fact that as the armies moved east and north, they moved further away from their ports, thereby increasing the length of their supply lines and the difficulty of getting the most essential supplies, notably fuel, up to the forward units. Arrangements to do this ranged from a priority trucking service, the Red Ball Express, to taking bombers out of service, rigging the bomb bays with rubber fuel bags, and sending them to Normandy as airborne tankers. James Lorenz of the 466th Bomb Group, 8th Army Air Force, flew one of these aircraft. In September 1944, our bomb group and the 477th BG were stood down from combat to haul gas to Patton's advance area in France. Using war-weary B-24s, the gasoline was either in 5-gallon jerry cans or in huge rubber tanks installed in the bomb bay, which could carry 2,500 gallons of gasoline. I flew 2 of these missions, and we got no mission credits, though we did lose several planes. We also got to see the war close up and were glad our job was flying missions. The Red Ball Express, so called from the priority signs carried by the trucks and on road signs, began on August 25, 1944, and lasted officially until November 15th, when the restored and repaired railway networks and the opening of more ports on the Channel coast gradually eased the pressure. The Red Ball Express operated 24 hours a day and was a good example of American ingenuity. Over 6,000 trucks were organized into convoys which carried more than 12,000 tons of stores and fuel each day from the Channel ports to the advancing armies. Such a vast quantity of supplies was needed. In the week of August 20th, the 2 US armies in France consumed 800,000 gallons of petrol, although around 300,000 gallons was used by the Red Ball trucks in just delivering stores. On a peak day, August 29, 1944, the Red Ball Express succeeded in delivering no less than 12,244 tons of supplies to the Third Army at Chartres, and more than 89,000 tons were delivered to Third Army between August 25th and September 3rd. Even so, the Red Ball Express could only be a temporary solution. What the Allies needed was more ports, nearer the battlefront. Allied arrangements to mitigate the supply problem displayed considerable ingenuity and enabled the Allied divisions to keep up the pursuit, but with petrol rationed and supply lines lengthening, the pressure on the enemy inevitably slackened, with unfortunate results later on. This became especially clear in September and October, when German units were able to reform, re-equip and hit back hard, notably at the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, and then at the US divisions fighting in the Hurtgen Forest near Aachen. For the moment, though, at the end of August 1944, everything looked possible as the Allied armies ended their efforts at the Falaise Pocket and set out to push the enemy north across the Seine, where all the bridges had already been destroyed and the Allied air forces attacked any temporary structures put up by the retreating Germans. Ralph Conte of the 416th Bomb Group, 9th Army Air Force, was flying a 20 attack bombers at this time. We were based at Wethersfield in England, and our mission was to hit bridges, enemy encampments, railroad junctions, airfields, marshalling yards, and provide support for the ground forces as required. I can recall attacks on Lesay Bridge, Belroy Railroad, Vita Bridge, and many more. Our formations of 36 or more planes flew at dangerously low levels, in weather which we would not normally fly in, from early dawn to late dusk. We wiped out practically all the bridges over the Loire and the Seine, keeping the Germans from escaping. Our most memorable mission was the bombing of the last bridge over the Seine, which the Germans were using to get their last troops out of the Falaise pocket. We were called on to cut this bridge at Oisel on August 6th. This, which had been attacked before and damaged but not destroyed. This attack was made at low level and against plenty of flak, and 11 of our planes were lost over the target. The scrambled fighting around the pocket had resulted in some confusion, so the next task for the Allied armies was therefore to tidy up their front and take up the pursuit. Tidying up being a particular requirement in any force commanded by General Montgomery, who was still the ground force commander. Monty liked a tidy battle, with no loose ends to unravel later, and after the pell-mell fighting at Falaise, Treurne and Chambois involving 3 Allied armies, there were many loose ends to tidy up. The Canadian 1st and US 1st Armies, now meeting at Treurne-Chambois and facing south and north, had to pull apart and turn east. This would allow the British Second Army, which, with the US First Army, had been one of the plunger forces that had squeezed the Germans into the pocket, to take up a central position between the Canadian First and US First Armies for the next phase, the advance to the Seine. The eventual organisation of the Allied armies for the pursuit up to and over the Seine had the Canadian First Army moving up the Channel coast, tasked with taking the ports of Le Havre and Dieppe, moving with the British Third Corps on the left and the 2nd Canadian Corps on the right. This would enable the Canadians to take Dieppe, where their 2nd Division had suffered so much during the raid of August 1942, and the 51st Highland Division of Crocker's 1st British Corps to take Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, where the original 51st Division, trapped against the sea, had surrendered to Rommel in 1940. Then came British Second Army, with 12th Corps on the left and 30th Corps on the right, and the other corps in reserve. The dividing point between the Canadian and British armies on reaching the Seine would be the city of Rouen. On the right of 30th Corps came 19th Corps of the US First Army and 15th Corps of the US Third Army. While other US units had been engaged in the battle at the Falaise pocket, 19th Corps had cut north and moved across to reach Elbeuf and Louviers, south of Rouen, on August 25th. This move by the US 19th Corps put them across their British front at Breteuil, and about a day ahead of the British forces who got up to Vernon on the Seine on August 26th. Also curving northeast was the US 5th Armoured Division from Patton's 15th Corps, 3rd Army, which also ran across the British front before Vernon. There should have been no problem about these moves by the 19th and 15th Corps, for the aim was to keep up the pressure on the Germans, and the British and Canadian divisions had been fully engaged at Falaise and needed to regroup. Inevitably, however, more carping arose, the Americans claiming that the British were slow, the British complaining that the Yanks had got in the way. No one seems to have appreciated that this move had been agreed between Dempsey and Bradley, that the 2 US corps which had not been engaged at Falaise should get their light forces up to the Seine as quickly as possible and destroy the light ferries, backs, which the Germans were using to evacuate their troops and wounded across the river. The heavy ferries and bridges were under constant air attack where they had not previously been destroyed. 19th Corps crossed the Seine south of Vernon. South of that formation came the US 5th Corps and 7th Corps, heading hard for Paris, moving along on the left flank of the Third Army. The map on page 390 explains this process, but, as before, to explain what happened after the victory at Falaise, it is necessary to go back and explain what took place before that to the US divisions moving east-south of Falaise. These divisions, mostly in Patton's army, were making good progress in early August because they were facing comparatively little resistance, so little indeed that on August 17th, Bradley had decided that the right flank of Patton's Third Army, moving north of the Loire, could be safely protected by aerial patrols of the 9th Air Force. Their southern flank thus covered, the broad front advance of Patton's 3 corps between the Loire and the Seine therefore proceeded apace. While Patton's 15th Corps was thrusting for Dreux and Montesgassicourt on the Seine, 30 miles southeast of Paris, on August 19th, 19th Corps of First Army moved in to fill the gap between Gassé and Dreux. That night, while this move was getting underway, the 79th Division of the 15th Corps, Third Army, entered Mantes and found the enemy gone. There was nothing to oppose a rapid crossing of the Seine at this point, and within the next 24 hours the 79th Division got across the river and deployed in the country beyond, digging in there in adequate time to beat off a hastily mounted counterattack by a fresh German division. This was the first crossing of the Seine, the move which, in his original plan announced back in May, Montgomery had decreed would be the last act of the Battle of Normandy. Monty had estimated that this act would take place around D+90, and it took place on August 20th, D+75. Montgomery had therefore beaten his own cautious forecast of the previous spring by 2 full weeks. This first crossing of the Seine also marked the point where Allied strategy had to change. This was the last piece in the Montgomery plan for Overlord, his great contribution to carrying out the orders given to Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, to enter the continent of Europe and undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. The first stage had now been achieved. The continent had been entered, and crossing the Seine brought the invasion phase of the war against Germany to an effective close. The Allied commanders now had to bring the next moves in the campaign under consideration: what direction their armies should take, what forces should be deployed, what the next bound forward should attempt to achieve, and also address the looming question of command. Montgomery had been appointed Land Forces Commander for the invasion phase. Although the duration of that phase had been left vague, with the Allied armies now over the Seine, who could now deny that the invasion phase was over. Monty himself had set the time and distance target the River Seine by D+90 for this phase. So what would happen now? Would Montgomery remain in field command, as he clearly hoped? Or, as almost everyone else hoped, would Eisenhower now take over direct command of the Allied armies and act as his own field commander, as well as Allied Supreme Commander? Monty clearly wished to remain as field commander after the Normandy victory, and may have felt that he was entitled to do so. After all, why break up a winning team, or, as the Americans say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Whatever the merits of his case, it does not require much hindsight to see that this wish was doomed from the start, and that any British claim to field command never stood the slightest chance of success. Montgomery could have been as able as Alexander the Great and as charming as Charles II, and it would have made no difference. This war in Europe was now dominated by the armed forces of the United States of America, and from now on the Americans were going to run it their way. Demographics and the US media would see to that. As the armies moved up to the Seine, pushing the scanty German forces before them, questions on the future command arrangements were frequently asked in the various army HQs and, above all, at Kiev. For the moment they remained unanswered by Eisenhower and the combined chiefs, but even so certain dispositions and assumptions had to be made. Time was passing, the armies were pushing on, and some direction was needed, if only to allow for whatever moves the Supreme Commander wanted when the Normandy campaign came to a close. Such arrangements were also essential to keep the enemy on the run, for, whatever happened, the pursuit must be kept up, the enemy forces closely pursued, and delay in that pursuit must be avoided. Therefore, on August 19th, the day the 79th Division reached the Seine, Montgomery took the issue in hand and sent out a directive to both army groups calling for the complete destruction of the enemy forces in northwest France. Then to advance northwards, with a view to the eventual destruction of enemy forces in northeast France. Montgomery was still the ground force commander and fully entitled to issue directives, but this particular directive involved matters of long-term strategy. The August 19th directive called for a push heading generally north through Belgium towards Holland and the Lower Rhine. To underline his point, Monty added boundaries for the two army groups, a line running from Argentan to Dreux-Mont, Amiens, Gand, Antwerp, with the British and Canadians to the west and the American forces to the east. As Montgomery saw it and stated later, with this plan the Allied armies would move like a great armoured wave, 40 divisions strong, marching north in line abreast to the frontiers of Germany. There they would muster along the Maas and Lower Rhine, cross the river, and so debouch on to the North German plain, advancing with their left flank resting on the North Sea to take the Ruhr and surge on to Berlin. American historians tend to refer to Monty's hankering after pencil-like thrusts, probably in reference to Market Garden, the Arnhem operation of late September. But it is important to realise that there was nothing pencil-like about the proposal in the August 19th directive. This was a broad front advance by a force of 40 divisions, and virtually unstoppable at this time, provided it could be supplied. Events in Western Europe from September 1st, 1944, after Eisenhower took command of the Allied armies, fall outside the borders of this book. The events between the Seine crossing on August 20th and September 1st are only included to round off events at the end of the campaign, but the discussion over the future command and direction of the Allied armies can be said to have begun on August 18th, when Montgomery sent a telegram to Alan Brooke. Have been thinking about future plans, but have not, repeat not, discussed the subject with Ike. My views are as follows. After crossing the Seine, 12 and 21 army groups should keep together as a solid mass of some 40 divisions, which would be so strong that it need fear nothing. This force should move northwards, 21 army group should be on the western flank, and should clear the Channel coast and the Pas-de-Calais and western Flanders, and secure Antwerp. The American armies should move on Ardennes, directed on Brussels, Aachen and Cologne. The movement of the American armies would cut the communications of enemy forces on the Channel coast, and thus facilitate the task of British Army Group. Bradley agrees with above conception. Would be glad to know if you agree generally. When I have your reply, we'll discuss matter with Ike. Montgomery was clearly trying to muster support for this scheme before he put it to the Supreme Commander, but in one respect he was wrong. Whatever Bradley had said or seemed to say at their meeting on August 17th, when future plans were discussed, he did not agree with this project. Bradley had discussed the future with Patton and says that they had decided that the first or American plan called for a thrust to the Reich straight through the middle of France to the Saar and beyond the Saar to the Rhine in the vicinity of Frankfurt. Both the 1st and 3rd American armies would be required for this effort. It might have been better if Bradley had been straight with Montgomery at that first meeting on August 17th, but he laid his cards on the table when he saw Monty again on August 19th. Monty then learned of this first American plan and heard that Ike supported it up to a point, and Monty raised no objection to Eisenhower, Bradley and Patton discussing future arrangements without his knowledge. It will be noticed that Bradley and Patton's first American plan seems to have ignored the very existence of the Allied armies from Great Britain and Canada. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, was aware that he had British and Canadians under his command, but he wanted to split the Allied forces and send the American half eastwards towards Nancy and the Saar, while the British and Canadians headed north for Antwerp and the Rhine. Monty knew of this when he issued his own directive, telling Brooke, "I have so worded my directive that we shall retain the ability to act in any direction." Here again, it might have been better if Monty had gone to Ike and asked him what his intentions were regarding the British and Canadian forces before issuing the directive. One suspects that Monty still hoped to remain as ground force commander and issued his directive as a prior statement of claim. On August 22nd, Monty changed his angle of attack. When the Deputy Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, visited his headquarters in France, Montgomery summarized his views on the Allied command structure and future strategy. He was adamant that the direction to go was north, that the two army groups, US 12th and British 21st, should stay together, and that single control and direction of the land operation is vital for success. This is a whole-time job for one man. Author's italics. He went on to add that the great victory in northwest France had been won by personal command, and ended by stating, "To change the system of command now, after having won a great victory, would be to prolong the war." Since none of this ever became Allied policy, it can do no harm to point out that much of what Montgomery stated was quite right and very sensible. To split the 12th Army Group and the 21st Army Group, when it had just taken their united efforts to defeat the Germans in Normandy, was not sensible. Not splitting your force in the presence of the enemy is a basic military tenet. Yes, for the moment the Germans were in disarray, but as the British were to find out a few weeks later at Arnhem, and the Americans a month after that in the Hurtgen forest, the German army was always a force to be reckoned with. The best way to the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr, was via the north, and this would also keep Allied supply lines short, a significant point at this time, when Patton's divisions were already coming to a halt through lack of fuel. On the command point, it is at least arguable that combining the jobs of Allied Supreme Commander and Ground Force Commander Chairman and Managing Director was a great deal of work for one man. The underlying objection to this proposal as it stood was that Monty clearly thought that the ground force commander as at present should be Bernard Law Montgomery. It is worth adding that when he realized that this was not to be, Montgomery offered to serve under Bradley, maintaining that the idea was sound and the matter of who did the job secondary. As to whether advancing north rather than north and east would have shortened the war, how can we tell? It did not happen, so any opinion can only be speculation. The question of whether Eisenhower was a competent field commander will be discussed in the next chapter. However it was entitled and whatever it contained, Montgomery's directive of August 19th was only a proposal. Eisenhower had not spoken, and Montgomery's tacit assumption that he would continue as ground force commander was a pious hope at best. However, lacking other orders at this time, the arrangements to implement this directive duly took place. Canadian First Army would wheel left at Rouen to reach the Channel coast north of the Seine at Le Havre, and then advance up the Channel coast, taking or sealing off any German-held ports and overrunning the remaining V1 sites. Second Army would cross the Seine between Mantes and Louviers and press north to cross the Somme, while the US 12th Army Group would consolidate south and southwest of Paris, but was not to enter the city until Eisenhower ordered it to do so. Wrecking Paris and soaking up infantry in a prolonged street battle was not part of the Allied plan. The German forces were in no state to resist these moves, provided they were executed quickly. Hitler was still issuing field orders, and on August 20th he directed Model to prevent the Allies. In this case, the Americans from pushing south of Paris towards Dijon, and hold a bridgehead on the coast south of the Seine around Touques and Honfleur, to collect any forces escaping across the Orne from lower Normandy. The basic idea was to create a new defensive line from the coast to Burgundy, running down the rivers Seine and Yonne east of Paris, where the relatively unscathed German First Army was deployed, then south to Dijon and east to the Swiss frontier. This line was to bar any progress towards Germany by the Allied armies, including General Davis's 6th Army Group coming up the Rhône Valley after Dragoon. As far as the Führer was concerned, if holding this line meant the destruction of Paris, so be it. To bring that battle on, a fresh German division was sent into Paris, and 2 more German divisions were directed to move into the line on the lower Seine. The Führer's plan was another pipe dream. Model did not have sufficient forces to create such a line, let alone hold it, and most of the forces he did have 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, though receiving some reinforcements after they crossed the Seine, were in no state to hold any line without rest and a chance to re-equip. Indeed, it is a misuse of words to call these 2 forces armies. Sepp Dietrich had only the remnants of the 5th Panzer Army to hold the entire front from the Channel to where the First Army took over west of Paris, and 7th Army, especially after General Hauser was wounded on August 20th, was in no state to fight at all. The best German option at the end of August was a fighting retreat until the Allied forces were brought to a halt by their ever-lengthening supply lines, but this option looked less plausible as the Allies reached the Seine and continued to advance. 21st Army Group advanced on a two-army front, 4 corps in line, with 8th Corps in Army Group Reserve. The advance went well and quickly picked up speed. The 11th Armoured Division entered Touquet on August 21st, taking L'Aigle on the following day. By August 23rd, 30th Corps were on the River Risle and met American armoured cars there on August 24th. The Canadians crossed the Risle near Bernay on August 25th, and on August 26th, the 6th Airborne Division and the 1st Commando Brigade, which had been in the line continuously since D-Day, took Pont-Audemer and finally came out of the line. At this time, the Second Army was obliged to disband the 59th Division of the 12th Corps in order to distribute its troops to the other divisions of the army. The 59th Division was the junior division in the British Army, and its place in the 12th Corps was taken by the 15th Scottish Division, and so the British advance continued and picked up speed. The US 12th Army Group began moving on Paris on August 20th, 19th Corps and 15th Corps from the west, 12th and 20th Corps coming up from the south. By August 19th, there were only about 6,000 German troops in the city, and on August 20th, the local French resistance, the FFY, rose against them. Sporadic fighting broke out all over the city, and Hitler's directive of August 20th to hold the city regardless of the destruction caused was ignored by the Paris garrison commander, General von Choltitz. Fighting continued until August 22nd, when General Eisenhower ordered Allied troops into the city, and General Leclerc's French 2nd Armoured Division rumbled in on August 24th, followed by the 4th US Division. Before then, however, steps to change the Allied command structure had been put in train. On August 23rd, Eisenhower and his Chief of Staff, Walter Bedell Smith, came to Montgomery's HQ and told him that the forecasted changes in the command setup would take place on September 1st. Eisenhower claimed that the reason for making the change was US public opinion, which would not permit General Bradley serving under a British general. The fact that a British general, Montgomery, had been serving under an American General Eisenhower for the past 9 months was not mentioned. Ike also wanted to head for the Saar as well as Antwerp and the Rhine, but agreed that the Saar attack must wait until the supply situation was easier. On the following day, as was his practice after a meeting with the British commander, Eisenhower wrote Montgomery a letter. The main points of this letter were that he had changed his mind. The Saar push was on again, and the two army groups would be known as the Army Group of the North Montgomery's 21st Army Group and the Army Group of the East Bradley's 12th Army Group. The fall of Paris on August 25th, although a cause of great rejoicing, was a sideshow to the main events in this closing act of the Normandy drama. South of the city, the Americans had now crossed the Seine in 5 places, and on August 26th, Patton's army advanced another 40 miles and entered Troy. As the American advance continued to the northeast, so the German First Army fell back towards the Marne, while on the British-Canadian front, 30th Corps crossed the Seine against stiff opposition at Vernon, and 12th Corps crossed at Louviers. By the evening of August 26th, the overall situation was as follows. The German armies were in full retreat, but fully capable of turning back for swift and savage strikes at their pursuers. On August 27th, for example, Tiger tanks and German infantry appeared before the British bridgehead at Vernon, and it cost 30th Corps some 500 casualties to drive them off and advance through the Forêt de Vernon. The 2nd Canadian Corps ran into stiff resistance at Elbeuf, where the surviving units of the 5th Panzer Army were assembling. Fighting along the river line continued until August 29th, the German line bolstered by the arrival of a fresh German division from the Pas-de-Calais and the tenacity of a number of tank and infantry Kampfgruppe, which had been ordered to stay behind and contest the Canadian advance. These actions cost the already reduced Canadian 2nd Infantry Division a further 600 casualties. Even so, in spite of this dogged opposition, With the Seine behind it, and the more open country of the Pays de Caux and Upper Normandy ahead, the British and Canadian advance speeded up. It continued to speed up, and the Second Army now got into that giant stride that would carry the 21st Army Group north to Brussels and the River Scheldt west of Antwerp in the next 2 weeks. On August 29th, the Canadians veered west to Le Havre, but General Crérat had no intention of letting the capture of that great port inevitably in ruins divert him from the pursuit of the 7th Army forces that had managed to cross the Seine. So the advance continued. On the right flank of the 1st Canadian Army, General Dempsey's 2nd Army began to charge north into Belgium. Their advance began on August 29th behind a screen of armoured cars provided by 30th Corps. German opposition fell away, and the 11th Armoured Division advanced 20 miles that day, taking more than 1,000 prisoners, brushing aside any opposition from roving Tiger tanks and scattered pockets of German infantry. On August 30th, all the divisions of 2nd Army were in full cry, heading north through flag-bedecked French villages, through cheering crowds of excited people and under a steady barrage of flowers and fruit. "The only injury I got in the war," said Ted Smith of the Guards' Armoured Division, "was when an apple thrown by a French girl hit me full in the eye somewhere outside Amiens." Gisors fell by mid-morning on August 30th, and the British armoured cars were in Beauvais in time for tea. There is no record that they stopped for it. Still, they pressed on, out of Normandy now and into Picardy, heading for Amiens, the capital of that province, across open country ideal for tanks and armoured cars. At 6 a.m. on August 31st, the 29th Armoured Brigade were in the centre of Amiens, brought to a halt by cheering crowds who refused to let them past. 2 hours later, General Eberbach, former commander of the 5th Panzer Army, who had just arrived to take command in the area, surrendered to men of the 11th Armoured Division. On the following day, British Corps took Le Havre, the 51st Highland Division marched into Saint-Valery, and the 2nd Canadian Corps pushed north to Neufchâtel and Dieppe, which fell on September 1st. On that day, General Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, assumed direct command of the Allied armies in northern France, and on that day, General Montgomery was promoted to Field Marshal, a consolation perhaps for some recent disappointments. And so, on September 1st, 1944, the Normandy campaign finally comes to a close. The Canadians were at Dieppe. British soldiers stood among cheering crowds of liberated Frenchmen at Amiens with a German general, the commander of an army that had fought them so hard and for so long, now a prisoner of the British Army. Paris, mercifully undamaged, was a free city after 4 years of German occupation, and the burden of field command had passed to Eisenhower. On balance, and in spite of the great cost in lives, the outcome of the Normandy battle was a good one, far better than many people expected when the Allied troops splashed ashore in Normandy on D-Day. Some, perhaps most, of the credit for that satisfactory outcome might go to Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery. There was time, just a little time, to enjoy this taste of victory before the pursuit began again. The European war would enter another year, and this present year would see hard fighting at Walcheren and Arnhem, in the Hurtgen forest and the Ardennes. The Allied soldiers enjoyed their brief triumph and the plaudits of the crowds that lined the roads as they advanced, but they were old soldiers now. These Allied soldiers, American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, knew that somewhere ahead lay the German army, still formidable, far from defeated, gathering its strength to fight again. To destroy that army and the regime that sustained it would not be easy, and more hard times lay ahead.